shame. Here are some like shame mechanisms and concepts to help further understand shame. And again, you might think you understand shame, but most people don't really understand their shame.
What if this AI-generated API key actually belongs to somebody who didn't secure their code properly? If it's not a private key, it could be intellectual property or other sensitive data from your company that's being...
Shame versus guilt. In my experience, guilt is a gnawing feeling about being unable to remedy a situation or feeling like you're failing others somehow, where shame automatically tells us we're inherently bad or a failure or not good enough. Childhood trauma coming from having abusive parents can involve what I call direct and indirect shame. Direct shame is like we're being told that finger in our face, you're a bad kid, I can't believe you just did that, you're bad in various ways. Where indirect shame can be about feeling embarrassed about something a parent does, or their character, or the type of house that you grew up in because it's chaotic or messy. I did a video on this topic of direct and indirect shame that I'll put in the description for you. Another concept is full of shame or shameless. Childhood trauma greatly influences our shame, either acutely elevating it, or we can really repress it greatly. Both have unwanted consequences in our lives and social life and intimacy in our functioning. I think of this as a spectrum of either being hyper shame-based, with high anxiety, or being a bit numb or shameless, which paradoxically is still operating from shame. So it's like hyper shame versus hypo shame. Being shameless can look like a vibe that's like, no one will ever mess with me again and I'm never gonna play the fool again, kind of a thing, from the fight response. And that is more repressed shame than everyone hates me in this meeting, neurotic type of shame. One of my favorite concepts to describe shame is shame being a fixed gravity thing. And a good analogy about shame is that shame is the main human emotion that other emotions orbit around, like the sun and the solar system. It's the main entree to the emotional buffet here. For example, you might feel intense shame if something sad happens to you, but you quickly start to compare your situation that you're sad about to maybe someone who has it worse. That's kind of a stuck thing with childhood trauma. The sadness that you're experiencing is in a fixed relationship to shame, which is like the sun in this analogy, and it can't escape the orbit of shame or the sun. And being right-sized or embracing your own sadness is being judged by your shame. Another example of the orbit thing is curiosity. You might be curious about doing some art or music, or be curious about what might it be like to do a creative project and be a creative person. But the shame, which again is the sun in this analogy, keeps that curiosity planet in a fixed, locked orbit, that curiosity can't fly off and explore itself. So that's what I mean about gravity, where other emotions and other things that we might want to do or experience is stuck in this fixed orbit with shame, this fixed gravity. Moving on, that shame can influence everything about us, like our purchases, to what we eat, to our social life, how we make our money, what kind of sex life do we have, what kind of sex do we like. There can be shame undertones through all of that. Do you sometimes feel bad about what you eat, what you buy? And this is one of those consistent thoughts that involve shoulds. I should eat more organically. I shouldn't like this kind of sex. I should never call in sick ever. I shouldn't buy these silly things. It's like a daily undercurrent thing that we need to dial into. Moving on, there's also shame in society rules. We can view shame as a good, like innate biological defense to be able to maintain our social status for our need to survive. Things go smoother socially in our lives if we're not doing shameful or antisocial, hurtful things where we're cast out of groups, which is what we need to kind of survive. Healthy shame, when it works, keeps us from being cast out of society by doing extreme hurtful acts. It would be cool if that's all that shame was, like thinking about morality or being conscientious. It would be great if our shame didn't go to such an acute and overwhelming over-the-top place and was just there to remind us to treat people the way that we wanted to be treated. Shame is also a big umbrella term. It also means things like being mortified, being embarrassed, feeling less than, ridiculed, indignity, which I'll talk about later, feeling humiliated, feeling found out or exposed, both from real situations or just things that we assume in our heads about how people might see us or how we might be being treated. Another shame-based concept is when we have a very shame-based parent. This is a big piece to all of these issues, is when we're being raised by a parent who was also marinated in shame their whole life, where they react deeply and intensely to what they perceive to be mistakes or how things look. Like a neurotic shame-based parent not in touch with their childhood trauma might freak out if you miss a day at school, because missing things is a reflection upon the family and upon them, and it's just something bad that they can't name is going to happen if you miss a day at school. So now let's talk about what is the opposite of shame. When I discuss shame, I like to add its opposite, which I believe to be the word integrity. Whether we're 2 years old or 80 years old, I think that humans feel good if they're seen as having integrity. Like, it bothers us when we don't. Integrity and dignity can be taken away in childhood trauma if we envision the heartbreaking scenario of, say, a 3-year-old toddler being screamed at because they had a bathroom accident. Really intense, direct shame. While it's slow around this idea of dignity and integrity, I believe that people are parenting children these days more from the idea of protecting their children from being shamed too much. Mistakes are just mistakes, and there's still love there. Healthy parenting is about when we understand that children are already vulnerable to shame, and our job is to protect them from experiencing too much shame. Too much shame is where the damage comes in. That's like an analogy about screaming at a toddler for having an accident. That's the stuff that stays with us. Even if parenting is extremely triggering and extremely stressful, but we still understand that we can't shame them too much. We still need to bring a lot of love and acceptance there. And I think that if we can help our kids maintain some power and some goodness and see their humanity, that's like the shield that protects us from childhood trauma. As we work on ourselves, we kind of reclaim these ideas and have a good foundation that we're a good person. And being a good person is to have some dignity, to have some integrity, and we have some power in being a good person. We have goodness in being a good person. We have our humanity there where we're okay to be human and make mistakes. Good enough healing, I think, is when we don't lose our power. And we're able to maintain our goodness. We're able to maintain and see our own humanity, even if we make mistakes or something comes up. That's a big difference. So here are some real life examples of shame to help survivors become more familiar with how the emotion works in us and manifests within us from the context of our childhood trauma. These are like everyday real life examples of how shame reveals ourselves to us. And keep thinking about how unnecessary or intense or maybe a bit over the top these are. I'm not judging you in that. I'm just saying if you grew up in childhood trauma, you were most likely set up to struggle with shame in an intense and unnecessary way, like I was. So I'll briefly name how the issue can come from childhood trauma, and I'll also try to give you an idea about what each example would look like if there was more healing taking place around the issue. And I'm going to be listing these from less severe to more severe. Number one is when we say, oh, you too. And this is a light example of shame where we're somewhere like an airport and we interact with someone who works there and tells us, have a good trip, and we respond with, you too. It's pretty funny, it's pretty innocent, but depending upon the severity of someone's shame-based childhood trauma, we can really perseverate on that funny little mistake. Why is it shame? And it's pretty normal, right? It's definitely normal, but mistakes are normal, but excessive shame really turns that up, and we walk away from that interaction really starting to feel terrible. Shame will manifest here by telling us that we're an idiot while we're walking away. And it can be worse if we tend to be unconsciously hypervigilant about trying to not be seen as an F-up. And not being seen like an F-up is really a big one for childhood trauma survivors. It was for me. Maybe I'm just more out with it now that I embrace my F-up qualities. After we say, you too, we might have a mini shame attack about something that is really just kind of a funny cliche. Our inner child can go to a place that I can't even pull off, trying to seem like a normal person. And that's a really big, intense, shame-based thought. This shame example can come from your childhood as having a strategy of having to hide how we feel about ourselves, having to hide what goes on at home, having to hide being told that we're a terrible kid. So we can go into schools as little kids and try to just pretend to be perfect. And then when something like a mistake, like a simple innocent mistake like this comes up, we can feel exposed and I can't even keep it together kind of a thing. Healing the shame on a deeper level with this one can just being able to see the humor in making a mistake and feeling that you're terrible somehow. Healing is also going to allowing ourselves to grace to simply being human. We can have magical thinking that we still need to be perfect and hide, and that isn't a human experience, so that's what I mean about the humanity. Number two, related to that, is bomb jokes, when we're trying to be visible or funny and that fails. If I made a joke in a meeting and it bombed, I would experience a deep physical sensation of shame, like a shame attack, and I would dissociate while hating myself for just taking the risk that I just took by telling a joke. Like my energy in my body would drop down to my feet and I would want to crawl into the woodwork to escape. It's awful. And the childhood trauma in this example could involve experiencing abuse where taking a risk inside your family, like making a joke or asking a question, could get you attacked. Expressing yourself could have immense contempt aimed at you and your family. It can also be trying to be funny and be liked, which is really a common thing for childhood trauma survivors. And being funny isn't bad, but we can really go into a shame hole when we want to be funny and it doesn't land. With more healing around this one, we again see our humanity, that some jokes are great, some jokes bomb, some are cringy, but those don't have to require a shame spiral about being a terrible person if we bomb. That is really about our family and not about the present. And as a side note, some childhood trauma survivors, this is super specific, some childhood trauma survivors tell jokes or make references that no one really gets because they're so specific. And yes, it could be a neurodivergent issue, but that's not what I'm referencing here. There's a phenomenon of an inner child thing where we kind of tend to think that everyone has watched episode 7, season 4 of Doctor Who, and we make jokes about it thinking everyone's going to kind of get that. We don't really kind of assume kind of a thing, but there's something kind of going on in it. I think it could come from really neglect and not learning how to read others or not learning how to do lead-ins with people like, have you seen Doctor Who? Are you a fan? To our social conversations. So the third one is taking it personally. I'm an idiot, I'm not an idiot. So our childhood trauma shame can make us react to basic questions and situations. It's like someone asks you a question at work and you bust out with, I'm not an idiot, you know, or you feel that on the inside. So like questions can really feel like accusations, or we overly read into them. We'll overly assume judgment from others and react from shame, which might take us down a shame hole for the overreaction of kind of getting fighty with somebody, or we can stay angry and self-righteous as well. It usually comes from a childhood of being the butt of jokes and the family behaving like the child is defective in some way. Or your family would talk about you behind your back or treat you like you needed special help when you actually didn't. Or you were judged simply for being a child and not an adult. So it's a highly common shame reaction for those who were scapegoated and things were extremely personal. And as a side note, the reverse in taking it personally is also the shame example where we always assume that we're wrong, and someone asks us the same question. One reaction could be, I'm not an idiot. The other reaction is, oh my God, I'm an idiot, they found out. Shame influences our perception about what people are communicating to us. We can greatly misinterpret questions and react from what the F do you mean by that to profusely apologizing, and both reactions are ruled by shame. And incidentally, working on our childhood trauma will take care of a lot of these shameful issues if we're really looking at how we lost our goodness in the family system. But healing with this one, what that might look like is that we're able to take questions and not take it personally or go to such an apologetic place, because again, we've got this foundation of knowing that we're a good person and we don't lose that. Moving on to number 4 is this idea that shame is contagious. Those who struggle with shame can overly take on or overly feel the shame of others in uncomfortable situations. Let's just say you see someone publicly make a fool of themselves because they drank too much, or someone at work was reprimanded for not showing up consistently. We can resonate with such people like musical tuning forks and feel terrible for them, and even feel terrible about ourselves somehow. That's how insidious shame can be. This can get us into trouble in relationships with emotionally immature or narcissistic people. We can overly feel for them in their mess and their mistakes, and like we resonate too much with their mess. This one can come from growing up with a parent who is immature or would make a mess out of their life, or somehow they might have been a tragic figure, like nothing went right for them. I'm not judging, this is real, or kind of, self-imposed by them. And as children growing up with a tragic parent or immature parent, we were really focused on them. We paid a lot of attention to them. We might have even been absorbed in their mess. And the shame can come from, as little kids, we want to be able to help them. We're not seeing them as an immature. We just want to help our parent who's a who's a hot mess. But the shame might come from our inability to do that. This one is also about not being protected as a child from adult emotions and adult situations. Like I often say, as kids, many of us knew too much. When shame is healed in a good enough way with this one, we can be sympathetic and empathetic for those struggling, but energetically, we're boundaried. And we don't have to take all of that kind of stuff on. We're able to kind of let people be themselves. There's no longer this gray area. And we're safe in ourselves to know that we're not bad for not taking someone else's mess on. What needs to get healed in this one, and I'll talk about later, is we can feel like we're cold or we're narcissistic for not taking on someone else's mess or shame-based situations of others and not helping them. Number 5 is I can't be like them. Related to the last one, I think childhood trauma survivors, most of our psychic energy about how we are in the world is about trying to not be like one or both of our parents. You might feel intense shame if you say no to someone, like in that last example, if you had an uncaring or unempathic parent who was all about themselves. You might feel intense shame if you forgot your wallet at lunch and a friend covers you. And that shame might be about having a parent who was entitled and took advantage of others, and being taken care of by a friend in that moment is intensely shaming or uncomfortable for you. You might feel some shame if things get a little bit messy in your apartment, or if you feel emotionally messy, if you had a parent who struggled with things like hoarding or having extremely poor mental health. So we can overly compensate in different ways to not seem like an abusive, unempathic, toxic parent. We can overly feel for others for not wanting to seem like an aloof, narcissistic, abusive parent. We can put a lot of energy into trying to not be a certain way in the world, which is childhood trauma-based shame in these examples. Healing this one looks like embracing on a deep level that we're not our parents, who behaved either shamelessly or had too much shame. We've separated from them through doing some work, and we know the difference of who we are as opposed to who they were or are. I think with this one as kids, we can feel like an accomplice to the parental dysfunction, which creates a deep sense of shame. And healing is about recognizing that we didn't ask to be part of any of that, their mess, and the shame belongs to the parents who had the responsibility for it, or their lives, or what was going on, not us as little kids. This is especially true if you grew up with addicted parents or parents who struggled with mental health issues or mentally off parents. So moving on to number 6 is what I'm calling pressured peers. Pressured peers is just what I'm creatively calling for the shame of feeling like you're not as accomplished or up to speed in life as other people your age. It's actually a great source of depression for people. We can feel intense, ongoing shame to see people our age to be able to do things like buy a house, have a career that's fulfilling, be social in a way that they might want to, be accomplished, be skilled, or even have kids. So this can be, and doesn't always have to be, an issue with childhood trauma. It can be about societal pressure to kind of like hurry up and die or hurry up in age. There's a thing in society that does that. Gotta get the degree, the house, the spouse, the kids, the career, and then at 70 you can just chill. Although with childhood trauma-based shame from CPTSD, there's a tendency to bloom later in life that I find, which I think is actually better. And I'm biased because I bloomed much later in life than my high school peers. But the shame here is about situations with not having a partnership when your peers have long since been in long-term relationships or married. The shame here tells us that society's standards are benchmarks to our worthiness. The benchmarks aren't shameful unto themselves, but for survivors of childhood trauma, intimacy and careers or being in the world seamlessly like others can be, it's a complicated thing that we have to kind of work towards or do work around. And a highly common childhood trauma issue is not wanting to have children for fear of harming them in the way that we were harmed, or not feeling confident to be able to get them what they need. That is both kind of a setup from our own childhood, but I also think it's kind of a noble decision of protecting. You're kind of protecting society from the same old stuff, which is, I believe, to be noble. And I know this is a deep, deep personal issue for people, so I don't mean to kind of speak lightly to it or go too fast. When this is healed, we can accept and embrace late blooming or our choices in life and our decisions, and it doesn't have to be such a heartbreaking comparison. Healing this can also look like doing some grief work around the time that we actually lost in bad relationships or the long careers, or struggling with our mental health. Again, we were set up to not be on the level of our peers because of what happened to us as children, and also due to all the energy we spent struggling with the trauma as we were going through adult life and development. The reverse of this issue is, this also happens for childhood trauma survivors, is that they approach all of those benchmarks with an intensity. I have to do this. This is what's going to make me worthy to have the house, the spouse, the kids, the career. But they're not present for any of it, which is sort of like the opposite of what I just described. With this idea of pressured peers, the benchmarks, the career, the house, the kids, they become evidence that we're defective. And a toxic family can also be pointing that out to us. When are you going to have kids? When are you going to do the thing? Can definitely parrot that narrative. A great source, again, of depression is how we compare ourselves to our peers. And I've done everything late in my life compared to the people that I graduated high school with, career, relationships, children. And I think it's more enjoyable to actually do late. And again, I think a great big source of depression is how we compare ourselves to peers. I've done everything late in my life compared to those who I graduated high school with. I got to my career late, my relationships late, I got to have children late. And I think it's more enjoyable to actually bloom late, to be more present when we are actually doing these things we want in life. Number 7 is what I'm calling enough is enough, traditional grip. So I've been playing drums since I was 11 years old. And for most of my time, most of my life, I've had this shame ghost kind of following since I started playing about that I've never learned something called traditional grip. Traditional grip is in your left hand or your non-dominant hand. Actually, you play the drum like this, and your other hand plays like this. It's like an old marching band kind of a thing. I learned match grip, which was kind of easier for me to find, and I never learned traditional grip. I'm a decent drummer who doesn't need or want to play situations where traditional grip would be really handy, such as marching band or jazz or fast fusion or anything like that. To my inner child for years, there was this, yeah, you might be a recorded drummer and people might want to seek you out to have you play in their band, but you never learned traditional grip. So shame tells us that you might, say, be a badass accountant who uses spreadsheets, or you're doing bookkeeping and you really know your